For decades, the most seasoned media executives in the industry, the most celebrated analysts on Wall Street, the most feared corporate raiders in the history of American capitalism, and the most vigilant institutional investors managing trillions in retirement savings all committed the exact same catastrophic error when they evaluated the merger announced on January 10, 2000, between America, Online, and Time Warner. They called it a vision. They called it the future. 99% of Time Warner's shareholders voted to approve it, and 97% of AOL's followed in agreement. Boardrooms across the country declared it the inevitable convergence of the old media world and the digital frontier, the moment that history would record as the birth of a new kind of empire, one that united the content of the 20th century with the distribution mechanisms of the 21st. The words synergy and transformation appeared in every press release, every analyst report, every breathless segment on financial television. They were wrong, not slightly wrong, not strategically wrong, apocalyptically, historically, irreversibly wrong. What they had just approved was not the birth of an empire. It was its public execution. The executives who engineered the deal watched the combined company's stock collapse with the kind of nauseating, helpless disbelief that only arrives when the catastrophe you have set in motion is too large to stop. Within 2 years, the company they had built on $350 billion of combined market capitalization had recorded the largest annual financial loss in the history of American corporate enterprise, $98.7 billion in a single calendar year, a write-down of $54 billion in the first quarter of 2002, followed by a further $45.5 billion before the year's end. Numbers so large that they ceased to feel real, ciphers of destruction that the financial press struggled to contextualize because no prior corporate disaster had produced anything remotely comparable. The man who had approved the deal, Time Warner's CEO Gerald Levin, celebrated just months earlier as a visionary architect of the digital age, would eventually call it, in his own words, the worst deal of the century. Any other corporation of Time Warner's stature, with its decades of irreplaceable intellectual property, its cable distribution network, its magazine empire, its motion picture studios, its news channels, and premium television brands, any other entity of that magnitude would have been immune to a single transaction, however poorly conceived. The brands Time Warner had assembled were not merely valuable, they were generationally durable. Warner Brothers had been producing films since 1923. HBO had invented the concept of premium television. CNN had built a global news infrastructure that governments around the world were forced to acknowledge. These were not assets that could be destroyed in the ordinary course of bad management. They required something more catastrophic, a merger so architecturally unsound, so culturally incompatible, and so catastrophically timed against the most violent financial correction the technology sector had ever experienced, that it could drain the accumulated equity of 7 decades in less than 3 years. But instead of recognizing those warning signs, instead of pausing at the staggering improbability of the deal's strategic logic, Time Warner's leadership did the unthinkable. They walked into the embrace of America Online, a company whose entire market valuation rested on a dial-up subscription model that was already technically obsolete at the moment the contracts were signed, convinced that the Internet's first great popular empire was also its permanent one. The deal closed in January of 2001. By 2009, AOL was spun off as a standalone public company, discarded like industrial waste from an entity that had once agreed to call it an equal partner. The greatest merger in the history of the media industry had become its most catastrophic divorce. This is the story of how America Online, a company built not on technological superiority, but on the sheer aggressive density of its marketing apparatus, convinced the most storied media conglomerate in the world that a floppy disk and a dial-up tone were the foundations of the digital future, how a visionary CEO mistook the peak of a speculative bubble for the permanent restructuring of civilization, and how one transaction destroyed more shareholder value, more institutional credibility, and more accumulated corporate identity than any single decision in the recorded history of American commerce. To understand the absolute depth of this catastrophe, we must rewind to the early 1990s, to a moment when the public mythology of America Online's rise has been carefully romanticized beyond recognition. The origin story that Silicon Valley prefers presents Steve Case as a digital pioneer, a visionary who foresaw the mass-market internet and democratized it for ordinary Americans through accessible software, friendly interfaces, and aggressive pricing. This is partially accurate and almost entirely misleading. What America Online actually built was not a technological infrastructure. It was a marketing mechanism of almost unprecedented aggression, designed to acquire subscribers at industrial scale, using a tactic so simple that its genius lay entirely in its repetition: the free trial disc. At the height of the campaign, approximately 50% of all compact discs manufactured worldwide bore the AOL logo. Over the 13-year life of the program, the company distributed more than 1 billion promotional discs to households across the United States, in magazine inserts, bank envelopes, pizza boxes, grocery bags, and hotel room key packets. Case and his team had calculated the lifetime value of a subscriber at approximately $350 and determined they could afford to spend $35 to acquire each one. The result was a subscriber base that grew from 200,000 users in the early 90s to more than 30 million by the year 2000, at which point roughly half of all American home internet users were accessing the web through AOL's proprietary walled garden. Their ultimate weapon was something entirely invisible: the friction of the unfamiliar. AOL's competitive moat was not bandwidth or speed or security. It was the fact that for tens of millions of Americans who had never used the internet before, AOL was the internet. The chat rooms, the buddy lists, the iconic chime of "You've got mail," these were not merely product features. They were the experiential architecture of an entire generation's first encounter with digital communication. Case had understood, earlier and more ruthlessly than any competitor, that the mass-market internet user did not want a technical platform. They wanted a front door, clean, familiar, and requiring no prior knowledge to open. AOL built that door, painted it bright blue, and charged $12 a month to walk through it. And for a period of several magnificent, delusional years, it worked on a scale that made the company appear invincible. By 1999, AOL's market capitalization had surpassed $200 billion. Its annual revenue approached $5 billion. Its stock had ascended on the fuel of dot-com euphoria to valuations that bore no traceable relationship to its underlying business fundamentals: a subscription service for dial-up internet access, competing against a broadband future that was already arriving. and against which the walled garden model offered no structural defense whatsoever. Case saw what was coming. The technological obsolescence of AOL's core product was not a distant threat. It was an active, accelerating reality. Broadband internet would eliminate the monthly subscription as the primary mechanism of access. The walled garden would be torn down by the open web. The dial-up tone that millions associated with connection would become the sound of a dying business model. And so he did what the most audacious corporate operators of his era would do when holding an asset whose value was about to collapse. He used the inflated currency of his own overvalued stock to purchase something real, but the golden era concealed its own terminal logic, and what it concealed most effectively was the speed at which the foundation would rot. The merger announcement sent both companies' stocks surging, and the financial press celebrated it as the deal of the decade. What the celebration obscured was the complete architectural incompatibility of the entities being combined. AOL was fast, aggressive, data-driven, and unsentimentally transactional. Time Warner was institutional, deliberate, brand-protective, and profoundly territorial about its existing divisions. The two corporate cultures did not merely fail to integrate. They actively, viscerally rejected each other, a transplant rejection so severe and so complete that the promised synergies never materialized in any form that could be measured or monetized. Executives from Time Warner's divisions refused to cross-promote AOL's services. AOL's executives treated Time Warner's content divisions as legacy assets to be extracted rather than partners to be cultivated. The promised convergence of content and distribution never happened because the people tasked with executing it could not agree on who was in charge, whose culture would dominate, or what the combined entity was actually supposed to be. Yet here lies the grand corporate plot twist, the moment when the catastrophe compounded itself with a cruelty that seemed almost deliberate. The dot-com bubble burst in the spring of 2000, just months before the merger was finalized. The collapse was immediate and devastating. Online advertising revenue, which AOL had aggressively booked as growth fuel, evaporated almost overnight. The company was later forced to restate $190 million in advertising revenue it had improperly recognized. The dial-up subscriber base began eroding as broadband became accessible and affordable. The stock, which had been the currency of the entire acquisition, collapsed, destroying not merely AOL's valuation, but the combined company's capacity to present itself as a functioning investment. In January of 2003, the company reported its $98.7 billion loss, removed AOL's name from the corporate title, and accepted the verdict that history had already rendered. Steve Case resigned as chairman. Ted Turner, who had brought CNN into the Time Warner fold and watched a third of his personal net worth evaporate in the collapse, departed with a bitterness he did not attempt to conceal. Gerald Levin, the architect of the deal, resigned in 2001 before the full magnitude of the destruction was publicly acknowledged. Fast forward to the present, and the assets that survived the merger's wreckage have dispersed into a landscape that bears no resemblance to the unified digital empire Case and Levin envisioned in January of 2000. Warner Brothers, Discovery now carries the entertainment legacy that Time Warner assembled across 8 decades. HBO remains one of the most respected premium content brands in the world. CNN continues to operate as a global news institution. AOL, the entity that claimed to be the future, that used $200 billion of bubble-inflated market capitalization to acquire a century of irreplaceable media heritage, was sold to Verizon in 2015 for $4.4 billion. $4.4 billion against a combined enterprise that had been valued at $350 billion. The arithmetic of this destruction is so extreme that it resists ordinary comprehension. We are left with two irreconcilable interpretations of what this story means. The first is the tragedy of hubris, of two leaders who looked at the speculative peak of a financial bubble and mistook its altitude for solid ground, who announced a merger at the precise moment when the conditions that made it conceivable were already beginning to dissolve, and who destroyed more accumulated institutional value than any single corporate decision in the recorded history of American commerce. The second is something closer to a parable of structural incompatibility, the story of what happens when two entities that share nothing except the desire to be relevant in the same future attempt to fuse themselves into a single organism, only to discover that the absence of cultural, operational, and strategic common ground is not an implementation challenge. It is a biological incompatibility. The body rejects the transplant, and the cost of the rejection, in this particular case, was measured in the hundreds of billions, because sometimes, hidden behind the language of vision and convergence and the breathless vocabulary of disruption, there is not a strategy. There is a hallucination shared by enough powerful people at the precise right moment of collective delusion to become the worst merger in the history of the world.